Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the Rodcast. Today I've got an extra special guest who is a residential real estate investment specialist with over 40 years in the industry. Specialties including institutional PRS, multifamily, build to rent, and currently is the CEO of the Single Family Rental Association. So welcome, Richard Berridge. Very nice for you to be here in our podcast studio.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. I think we've had a quite interesting conversation already. So
we have. I'm hoping you can repeat some of the fantastic things you've said.
Welcome to the Rodcast with Rod Turner, the show all about real estate. We discuss everything that affects asset-backed businesses, investments, and go deep into the details with some of the best in the business.
So, Richard, do you want to give our audience a bit of background as to how you came to be part of the Single Family Rental Association, and a bit of background in terms of your career in real estate?
Yeah, well, first of all, sort of career in real estate started a long time ago, and I think quite possibly a lot of us probably started off in sort of agency. And I worked for Mann & Co. My first job was Mann & Co. in Potter's Bar, and from there on, I'm sorry to say this for Mann & Co. because I'm sure you're all lovely people, but the only way is up. And I also to the people, I apologise to the people in Potter's Bar as well, perhaps. But it was in a place called Darks Lane, so that just about tops it off. And then thereafter, I worked to an agency in London. I worked for an Irish developer, and I've since gone through the whole thing in terms of property management, property development, property investment, and agency. So I like to think that I've got a pretty good idea of what the property industry looks like, as a sort of holistic view. And I was sort of working in London in 2000s. Principally in sort of the property investment market, and just during the course of the GFC, I worked for a business called Residential Land, and we had to very quickly sort of refinance a lot of our properties not because we were in trouble at all, but actual fact the people who were funding us were in trouble. And that was one of the banks, so I'm going to leave it to speculate who that might be. And so we bought back a lot of that stuff. And at the same time, we also did a deal with Ivanhoe Cambridge, a big institutional Canadian funder who would do a lot of institutional real estate funding right around the world, and also Apollo Global Real Estate. And that was one of the first times I got involved in that sort of institutional piece. And that was just about 2010, I think, 2009, 2010. Thereafter, we were involved in institutional sort of real estate and talking to MSCI and all those sort of businesses that focus our data around institutional funding and institutional housing, particularly residential. And then, as a lot of people might remember, the Montague report came out in 2012, making certain about 5 sort of key recommendations, one of which was a PRS task force, which lasted about 2 years. But also, it was also supposed to start to look at, what would institutional funding look like? And I think it was entitled, that report, the barriers to institutional funding of the PRS things, off the top of my head. And it really sort of, although there were some players earlier on, there was sort of Delancey who had bought the Athletes Village, and there was Fizzy Living who had done a deal with Metropolitan Housing, and they had done that sort of in 2010, 2011. That sort of report kicked off the whole interest, if you like, in the institutional investment in housing. And as we discussed sort of off mic, if you like, that is not something that is new. It's been going on for an awful long time. And back in the 30s, build to rent, if you like, was a thing. And there were things in big buildings in Balham, and there's obviously we discussed Dolphin Square, which was originally a build to rent scheme, if you like, built in the 30s. So there was a lot going on. But it, obviously, and as they say, and as my sort of Indian friends say something, there's nothing new under the sun. Acha. And there isn't. There isn't. We like to think we've reinvented it, and we haven't really. But what really came out of it, because of institutional investment, was that idea of reputational risk and how's it going to be controlled, and looking again at the private rental market, which hasn't, as you know, had a great reputation, and saying how can we improve things. If we're going to be involved in this, it's got to be an awful lot better than it is at the moment. We have to stick to what we say we're going to do. We're going to work with government and so forth, and just make it a better place. And so I suppose it's from around that time involvement with Ivanhoe, about 2010-ish, is when I sort of came into the institutional investment in residential, which probably is one of the earliest of the contemporary type, our time, if you like, is when it really started in many ways. And so that's how I got into it. It's been what's termed multifamily, most of it, which is the sort of dense urban stuff, with amenities and businesses, like, well, not businesses, but sort of organizations like the Urban Land Institute did tours over in the States. The UKA was born around 2016, so it's that the UK Apartment Association, and they've been instrumental in pulling together people, operational management businesses, suppliers, investors, and so forth, into that sort of urban environment, talking about regeneration and so forth. And I was a member of the UKA at one point, but sort of latterly I've been more interested in houses. The point about houses is that in the UK, at least 80% of us live in houses. And pretty much over time, 80% of what we build, generally speaking, in this country are houses. And 60% of the PRS are houses. So it's a bit of a no-brainer, really, when you start to think of what can we do in this market that genuinely is impactful, and where generally we can build everywhere. Whilst the urban stuff is great, very high quality, brilliantly managed, can only touch a relatively few number of people. It's quite small. The viability assessments that go into, is this worth doing, are pretty much restricted to only a certain number of locations. It's not a few number, but in terms of where you can build houses, it's quite tiny. And we can build houses anywhere. And I've obviously gone on far too long now. And I don't want to hog this whole podcast.
Well, it's fantastic that you mentioned Balham, because I live in Balham.
Duquesne Court.
Duquesne Court. I wrote Duquesne Court down, which is an Art Deco kind of huge kind of.
Yeah, it was funded by Royal London. It was originally designed as a build to rent scheme. I did a piece on it years ago for someone who wanted to know a little bit about the growth of build to rent. We focused on that. It had 600 and something apartments. It was originally supposed to have squash courts and tennis courts.
Had a swimming pool.
It had, I think, it might have a swimming pool. It had a restaurant. It had a dairy. It had a gravity postal feed, so you could put post in it and go down to the concierge. It had a concierge. It had a telephone on each floor, so they didn't have any rooms those days. And they all had radio stations, radio receivers within each of the flats that could receive two stations, because there were probably only two at those days. But yeah,
fantastic.
It was designed as a rental product, just as today's products are designed as rental products.
Yeah, with all the amenities as well. Yep. Absolutely amazing. So, I mean, you've kind of touched on some of it in your introduction, but how would you say the single family kind of rental market has changed over that period of time? And what's been the main reason that institutions have not kind of ploughed money into it pre kind of 2010 and when you got involved?
Well, in a word, scale. It's difficult to scale. Well, I say it's difficult to scale. It's a matter of perception. If you are investing in large urban schemes, and you've probably seen stuff from the British Property Federation and Savills, they produce a quarterly index about who's doing what, how many operational units are, how many.
30,000 in use and 70,000 in planning and things like that.
Yeah, I think there are about
so still
around 90,000 in all. 10,000 of which are houses, sure. Most of are apartments. But if you look at that, if you look at the average size of each of those schemes, it's 200, 300 plus. And so if you're investing significant sums, deploying capital, the institutions like to deploy big numbers. Mm-hmm. And with houses, you can't really deploy big numbers into one scheme because the density is very different. and the absorption rate is very different and the whole thing. So you don't get, and you probably wouldn't get 500 houses in one space in every bed, because the funny sort of thing is around houses, they work better as a multi-tenure within a multi-tenure environment.
Yeah.
Whereas with the blocks of flats is that the whole ethos behind multifamily is to sort of single ownership and management of one block. So they wouldn't have a pepper block, generally speaking. It would be pretty much wholly owned and rented, and that's all controlled by the management business. Whereas homes are very different. Houses are very different. They can be pepper potted. Some people do it. Companies like Hearthstone, for instance, an investment company, an institution, will buy as few as like 6 or 7 houses at a time, and they will. I wouldn't say necessarily pepper pot them, but some of them do. But they'll have a small, let's say, a terrace of 5 within scheme, and then another 5 somewhere else within that scheme. So yeah, it is very different. And so the way that most institutions scale is not to buy 5 houses or even 30 or even 50. But the interesting thing is that it can be done, and it can be done through a number of ways, mostly with partnerships with buildings. So one of our members, if you like, certainly our board members, Sigma Capital, they own and operate 5,000 rental houses. But their average size here, I know that Rob Sumner's probably going to correct me here, but it was at one time just over 60. So that's not the sort of number where most institutions go, yeah, we'll take those 60, because they really want to take those 300 or 400 or 500 or whatever it is. So it's scale, really. And I think that one of the interesting things that we can learn from the States is that you can buy small numbers of houses and agglomerate them, as you build them into a much bigger portfolio, and that's what they did in the United States. So while their single family market was only really born just after the GFC, and yes, they did initially buy like tranches of mortgage defaults, they also bought single houses in single locations.
Because the US has a much bigger single-family rental market than we do over here, and you mentioned it only was born out of the GFC. Do you want to kind of go into a bit more detail on that? How did that come about, and what were the reasons behind it?
Well, I think it was quite clear that after the GFC and after those mortgage defaults, the big institutions who are well organised and have great data, and they do, sure that there was an arbitrage between what they were selling at and what they could rent them for. So obviously the yield was going to be quite high. And so they went and bought a lot of those. And then they continued doing that after the GFC by basically buying single houses. And they put a lot of effort into that. And they would sort of scrape all the portals and the Zillows and all those sort of things. And then go out and buy these houses, go to auctions, go to listings and just buy stuff they thought. Latterly, and so they're now up to, about, I'm trying to think, must be about 700,000, I think, they've got in the United States, something along that, not along that number. It's not actually huge when you consider the United States.
Well, I was going to say, what kind of percentage is that? Because I know in the UK, if we think about the rental sector, build to rent as a whole is still a very tiny proportion. Yeah. And obviously single family homes within that is minute. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the rental sector and the build to rent rental sector is about 2%.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a couple of points either way.
Sure.
And we're sort of 10% of that.
Yeah.
So 0.2%.
Yeah.
So it's very small, and yet the potential for single family housing in this country is greater than it is for.
Well, like you said, 80% of us live in houses.
6% in Paris. Yeah. So just want to sort of touch back on the States. What's interesting, because in only one way are they slightly behind us. When I say slightly behind us, is that latterly they have coined something which, and there's always a mismatch in terms sometimes with the States, but they have coined something that's called built for rent. And that's actually the purpose-built housing complexes for houses as opposed to apartments. They don't call their apartment business built for rent, they call them.
Yeah.
So, and they've only relatively recently started that, and they are actually behind us. Having said that, they of course aren't known to take this really quickly.
Yeah,
because that's the nature of the states. They do then stuff.
Is there a big difference then about these companies and maybe institutions? I mean, I typically think of Granger BLC buying up single family houses, but they're older stock. So where does the build to rent side of it come into play, and how much of that what's the growth of that sector like at the moment in the UK?
Well, just going back to companies like Granger, you have to bear in mind that Granger are historically a very old company, and a lot of that stock that you just talked about there is legacy stock. And when I was an agent a long time ago, and I haven't really looked recently to see what they're up to, but they used to sell off quite a lot of that legacy stock, that individual years, because it's just not efficient to hold them anyway. Single years is costly and expensive to manage if they're sort of outliers, But the build to rent thing was it's designed really to fulfill the requirements of institutions. So we probably talked a little bit about sustainability and environmental, social, and governance, and you have to bear in mind that those that acronym ESG. One is supposed to focus equally on those three elements, and not just either environmental, social, or government. So when you talk about ESG, you should be talking about the whole piece. But the build to rent stuff came around is because nothing really existed at that time that was suitable. Yes, I think some of the early schemes were bought from developers who were originally, and the buildings were originally designed and intended for open market sale, but chose to sell to an investor. So they probably weren't optimal in lots of ways. And you have to bear in mind that, in terms of operational management, you want to be able to operate something in terms of for urban schemes, more like you would operate a commercial building. I'm not going to say hotel necessarily, because it's not the same thing, but those efficiencies that are built into building, which mean it's easy to manage or operate, and all that kind of work is easier and less expensive. And so, certain designs were adopted as well. So the apartments themselves tend to be more efficiently designed. They tend to be sometimes a little smaller, but only basically because those areas that one never uses in an apartment, like the corridor spaces, for instance, you don't live in. You only kind of walk down, So there was a more efficient sort of design work. And there's a lot of architects who have specialized in that. Sale, for instance, I think it's RKL, have been at the forefront of sort of, revisiting the design of apartments and how can you make them more efficient, and how can you make the living space, if you like, more appropriate to work. So that came in, and that just kind of means that, the institutions that are getting classically a much more efficient building. And it's a much better space to live in.
Yeah. And how does that kind of transfer into single family homes that are being built? Are they still able to get those efficiencies?
Well, I think we have to look at certain trends at the moment as well. I think they do look at those sort of efficiencies, but we're also looking at things, for instance, like, what would this place be like to work from home? Because we look back at the COVID time, and it's not that long ago, and it interrupted 2 years of all our lives and the way that we lived, and we sort of, all of us sort of revisited, what we did, how we worked, where we worked, and that kind of stuff. And so, do we have to travel on the train so much? And I've come to see you on the train today, and I come on a Friday, virtually empty. Now, if I come on that same train on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, standing remotely. But Mondays and Fridays, not so much. But so people do work from home an awful lot more. So, with the houses themselves, the interesting thing about houses is that they're probably more sensitive to local vernacular, right the way across the country, whether something might be built of stone or brick or rendered or that kind of stuff. So they're entirely flexible in that space, and they have to fit in, and work well with a local environment. And they tend to be built, on the outskirts or the sides or a site within an existing urban environment, with an existing sort of suburban environment. Sure. I live, in a village called Crayshall in East Hampshire. It's a big village, and it's got a Sainsbury's and a co-op and about 600 hairdressers, and almost as many estate agents, and then a few other shops. But single family housing, would work in Grayshot as a village, and it doesn't need that huge density to upload. So we could put, let's say, 30 houses there and rent the lot. So it is all very different, and with the houses particularly, I think they will be focusing much more on sustainability, and that means built locally, from the local resources as much as possible, with local labour as much as possible, so that travelling time for resources is reduced, so that carbon footprint is reduced. And then the energy efficiency of the building. We're talking about buildings that will probably have some photovoltaics on the roof, energy storage systems, some battery, underfloor heating, as much as possible. Certainly, pretty much all of them, I think, coming through now. I've seen got air source heat pumps, although easily, they could be ground source heat pumps, and that's an interesting place because you can service kind of sort of 3 homes with one ground source heat pump. So that's all interesting. And EV charging points and all the insulation values that go around that, and even passive house now is becoming more affordable to deal with.
And I guess investors like that because they're looking at the long-term returns, and obviously if they're reducing their operational costs and things like that, that's going to help. And if they don't do it now, we spoke off camera before just about kind of rules and regulations coming into play. At some point, we're pretty sure that there will be some regulation around kind of EPCs, however they're calculated. But retrofitting is often more expensive, isn't it?
It is quite expensive, and I think a lot of clearly a lot of the investment coming in at the moment is going to have an impact on how house builders build. I think in the future, and I think it's a funny sort of way. Sometimes incentives, are sort of push-pull or carrot and stick out in other ways. And I think probably we've all worked in industries where there's been a slightly unexpected way that things change, and for our industry, our institutions who are investing in houses, are signed up to sort of European directives, and that's not because whether it was Brexit or not, they invest in Europe, and so pretty much every big institution around the world is signed up to the SFDR regulations, which means that ultimately anything they invest in has to be demonstrably, green, and have social impact and great governance. And so, in a roundabout sort of a way, that's going to incentivize builders and developers, house builders, to build in that way, because otherwise the money that they get from these institutions, in whatever form they get it, whether it's loan or as a joint venture or whatever, is going to be more expensive. Or, they simply won't get it at all,
So it's not actually about the UK's regulations, it's about the regulations of wherever if they're, like you say, most of them are investing globally. So it's about what they need to do, and clearly the UK are a little bit behind.
Well, I think even smaller investors are going to have to be aware that, in terms of what their portfolios look like, you've got to be saying, okay, what's coming down the road? And I think we sort of touched on this before. And I was sort of talking about sometimes these things can get kicked down the road a little bit, and you kind of say to yourself, well, I'll do it when I have to. But the way that I explained it is, I think it's a really good way to explain it, because someone explained it to me like this, and I thought, that's dead right. It's a bit like that sort of Monty Python's Holy Grail film, when they're trying to siege the castle or attack the castle. The attackers look as though they're actually getting further away because they can get kicked under it, but all of a sudden, bang, they're on top of you. And that's what it's going to be like. So you have to be ready, and you have to make sure your portfolio is in the right space.
And also, when it comes to that point where bang, it's on top of you, it's on top of everyone. So trying to get labour, materials, all these things, it's going to obviously cost more. So make hay while the sun shines.
Well, this is exactly that. I'm also a trustee of a small housing association where I live, and there's always a temptation to say, well, we haven't got enough money to do that, let's do it later. And you go, what's going to cost more later? And there's also the tendency for people to say, well, I'm not getting ground source heat pumps, I'm not getting air source heat pumps because we don't know how good they are. And they go, well, we know how good air conditioning units are, and they only work in reverse, so that's how good they are. They've been working for years, and you've got people like Dakin and Mitsubishi and all these guys do it, and frankly, they're pretty good. And then they say, well, we can't maintain them. I said, listen, you can maintain them. If you maintain them in the same way as you maintain your boiler, every year, it's the same thing. And if you do that, they'll work properly. If you don't, they won't. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't drive your car until it ran out of oil, down the M1, would you?
Sure.
You get it serviced.
Yeah.
So Yeah, keep it serviced.
And so, who was building and investing in new build rentals, or even just single family rentals? I don't know, pre 2000 then, and how's because obviously we know obviously it's institutions now. Was it a case where it was just councils building these properties after the war for rentals?
Obviously, RPs were doing it, so they've been doing it for quite a long time, and there's been a sort of transition from councils, sort of handing over, transitioning sort of the original properties over to RPs. But a lot of those guys, depending on where they were, found that a lot of the stock that they got wasn't fit for purpose. In lots of ways, it was a lot of legacy stock. Like some of the stock that we've got for our very small housing associations, a lot of legacy stock. Ideally, we wouldn't own it, but we have it, and we look after the people in it. But so we don't want to get rid of it because it suits people. But in terms of building homes, it was just home builders building for sale, or councils, not so much in those days, but quite a long time ago, yeah. But or residential or registered providers. So it wasn't really a thing, And also, you have to bear in mind that ASTs didn't come in until I can't remember the date now. I think it's 89.
Yeah.
It was 89.
I think it was 89 or 99.
Yeah, 89. Yeah. And prior to that, there was this whole issue about we don't everybody who goes in gets security tenure, and we can't get them out if we have to. So it was only after that time that really it became a thing to be invested in, because ASDs came in, and that was a great thing to have. And I know that there's the rental reform bill going through Parliament at the moment, and we're going to get rid of Section 21 and a few other things coming in, which means actually they have to get rid of the AST, predicated on that with fundamental foundations. So it's interesting to see what comes out of that in the future. I think it's right that there's a more equitable balance, and I think I've spoken to Beth Beadle on this. I think the NRLA have a particular viewpoint, and I think we support them on that. So,
because I think where do the SME home builders come into play? Because it seems like they have actually picked up a lot of the slack, and also the large home builders for building new homes. But the majority of those have been for sale, like we said, and because councils are no longer building because they've not got the capital
or
money. Yeah, well, exactly. And so now we're seeing that kind of the private sector is doing a lot more. And is there opportunities there to be partnering with some of these institutions?
Oh, absolutely. And this is one of the key things that we're talking about, because as I sort of mentioned at the beginning, with houses, you can build them everywhere, which means that anybody can build them, the SMEs. So the SMEs, funny enough, are absolutely fundamental to what we are trying to achieve. Because we know that the big institutions have been doing. If you think of multifamily, for instance, as tier one, in terms of the consultants or the construction businesses and the investors and so forth, single family rental can be tier one as well, in terms of who's involved in it. But it filters right down to grassroots, because if you can build a house anywhere, you can have single family rental anywhere, and you can build a house anywhere. And that's the key thing, is that we want to bring a better standard of living and all the advantages that come with having a professional landlord and professional management to all of the country. And at the moment, we're only bringing it to a fairly small number of people who live in dense urban areas. And we want to be able to do that right the way across the country. And some landlords are exiting, and it's not as if we're going to take over the world, because we're definitely not going to take over the world. There's one of the things that I think is important to remember is that there's always room for everyone in the market. Nobody's out to kind of
monopolize,
corner the market or monopolize it. So that's never going to happen. But what we do want to do is to have a good standard of investor. We want to attract good quality investment. We want to attract responsible investment into the market, green investment into the market, and we can do that by building single family houses right way across the country.
And I mean, the PRS has had a bit of a PR disaster over the last kind of couple of decades, probably now. And has that been a barrier for institutions to come into the market? And are there any other reasons why they haven't? And if so, what's changed now to make them be attracted to it?
Well, reputationally, PRS has never had a great market. You think back down to Lloyd George after the First World War, coming back building homes for heroes. that's when that whole market changed, and the view wasn't the whole why it changed. There was always been a view that sort of landlords were rather avaricious in taking advantage the whole time. And during the course of the First World War, some rents in certain areas went up exponentially because they could, and because the war effort was focused in other places, and landlords were just charging whatever they felt like charging. And it was after that the big PR push by government at the time was to talk about home meaning own, basically. So basically, and if you look at the narrative since around 1920s, that whole narrative was around if you called something your home, then you owned it. And all the magazines at the time created that narrative, going through, and that's what sort of happened. And so we get to a stage at the moment is that in thinking about it in other terms, for instance, is that the rental market is seen as an undesirable necessary, if you like, and everybody talks about ownership as being the ultimate dream. And if you look at any of the data or polling on home ownership and who wants to own their own home, it basically comes out that 90% of people aspire to own. We've never really analysed that enough to know whether that's truthful or not. You do end up with an asset, but it's really only people like me, a baby boomer, who's done really well out of it. People buying today, they're not going to see the exponential growth in property values that I experienced, very fortunately. So, is it such a good thing to own? I think on the whole, probably yes, and I think our sector has to acknowledge that. We do come up with an awful lot of stuff around, lifestyle renting and things like that, but it doesn't.
It's a small portion of society, probably.
Yeah, it's a small number of proportion of society, and we live in a pretty cynical world, and people kind of examine that and go, "That's not really true." To some people, rental is an essential way they live, and some people can't afford to buy. Some people don't want to buy,
and some people won't ever be able to buy. Is the reality? Yeah.
Well, I mean, that was the thing in the past. I was brought up in a council house in Northamptonshire when I was young, and those people were perfectly happy in the council house. They were well supported. Council came out and did all the repairs, and never owning wasn't necessarily an issue. I think the big issue here is when we had right to buy. It's not necessarily the right to buy policy itself, but the fact that we never replaced the social housing.
And that is the problem really with when people say, well, it's fine, owner-occupiers can buy the rental stock. But the problem is there's more occupants in let's say you have a two-bed house versus another two-bed house. There's always going to be a higher occupancy in a rental than there is. So you're left with net demand on the housing sector. And so that seems to be the big problem with that kind of point.
Yeah, I think what we've done really badly in this country is I think that we've stimulated the demand side over supply side. And I think we've got, and I don't have the answers here, but I think we've got to come up with a way of stimulating supply side better.
Well, it's to encourage investment into that sector, isn't it?
I suppose in a small way that's what we're doing in terms of demand. We know that there's demand to rent because there's a lot of people there. There's about 5 million.
5 million on the homeless list at the moment.
Yeah, 5 waiting list. There's 5 million people in the PRS at the moment, and that's not going to fall anytime soon with the affordability crisis that we're having. And that affordability crisis isn't going to change because if it is going to change, what are we going to see in the market? Well, we're going to see rampant inflation in terms of the wages, and that only leads to rampant inflation in terms of other things. So again, it's not going to really help. And at the moment, we're playing catch up in terms of what we can afford to buy. And when I first bought it was like 2.5 times salary. Not anymore.
Yeah, but I think it's relative because when you first-time buyers, when they buy, they're not buying in cash, are they? So looking at that is kind of irrelevant. It's, well, let's look at one, what our upfront costs are as a percentage of earnings, and then two, what our mortgage servicing costs are as a percentage of earnings. And actually, on the whole, we're still spending the same amount per month of our earnings on servicing because mortgage terms are double what they were. They're 40 years now.
I know, that's just a quite story. We're going to end up with with lifetime mortgages.
Well, I was trying to stay happy.
Mortgage, yeah. I'm sure that really will. But do you want to? The thing is with that mortgage property, you don't really own it. That's the problem.
Well, I get that point. You do own it because it's just someone's got the charge there and things like that, and you can sell the debt and all that kind of thing. But yes, I get your point.
I think I was happy to do it because I knew. Well, I didn't know, but what seemed to be the case and what became embedded in during my ownership, with my mortgage lifetime, was that if I sold it 2 years later, I'd be guaranteed enough to bet it pretty much. And I would do that. And if I bought I remember buying a flat in Balham once. I used to live in Huron Road.
Yeah, I know very well, right by the Common.
Yeah, so I used to live in the top floor conversion of flat in Huron Road. We paid £110,000 for it, and we sold it 18 months later. We put a new kitchen in, by the way. That's one thing we sold it 18 months later for about 170.
Yeah, so nice 50 grand kitchen, was it?
Yeah, well, that's it. So, but I can't see that happening these days.
But if you look at it in real terms, it's even worse. I mean, we're down from 2015 in London in terms of real pricing of housing.
Yeah, so it's hard, isn't it? I mean, I'm not here to advocate renting.
Mm-hmm.
Renting is a real thing that everybody at some point had to do. I've rented in the past. It's about making that period of time renting better, rather than trying to sort of corral people into renting.
And I think that's got to be from both parties, because that can only benefit everybody, investors and occupiers as well, can't it? Yeah.
I think the trouble is sometimes you have to go into this unilaterally, don't you? Sometimes you have to say, well, who's going to make the first move? Who's going to say, okay, right, I know you guys don't really think very much of landlords and you're renting from them and you've all had horrible experiences and you all hate your agents and all that kind of stuff. But if someone doesn't make the first move, nothing's going to happen. So I think what the institutions did, okay, well, let's make that first move. We have problems with reputational risk, but it's not something we want to get involved in. So if we are going to get involved in something when potentially we could really come a cropper, then we have to do it properly.
And you kind of, when you talk about reputational risk, what is it that the institutions are worried about?
Well, I think we sort of explained is that if institutions invest in all types of real estate, so they'll invest in sheds and invest in offices and retail parks and that kind of stuff, shopping centres and so forth. Most of the streets. But if they have a row with one of their occupiers, if they have a row with Roots or someone like that, nobody gets monkeys about that. Nobody cares whether Boots and an institution are having a big row about rent. If they own, say, 10,000 residential homes, whether it be single family or multi-family, and they have a row with someone, given sort of social media is today, that'll be plastered all over the place. And the row might be completely blown out of all proportion, but they'll still, it'll still be everywhere, and people will be opining on it and on every social media platform about what they think should happen and how dreadful everybody is. But the point, and that's the reputational risk that you have when you're investing in residential. A commercial dust up doesn't really elicit any sort of attention, but with an individual it does.
So what's changed to make institutions more kind of go into that sector more then? I think in terms of that.
From what I see, I can't say that there haven't been some issues. From what I know, in terms of the institutions that I know and the efforts they put in, it's all about minimising that risk through being the best landlords they can possibly be, and that's really what it boils down to. And I think they've focused on that, laser focused on that right from the beginning. And the operational management companies like Urban Bubble and Verve Life, just to name a couple, have been, are at the forefront of that sort of, to use a phrase here within the industry, customer-centric approach.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. We're just going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. So, what would you say some of the headwinds are for the sector at the moment?
Well, it has been the Trussonomics was a bit of a headwind for everybody, I think, and it certainly caused a lot of investors to sit on their hands because they weren't quite sure in which direction the economy was going. I think that since that, I think government has been struggling quite a lot in order to stabilise the markets a bit. And we have seen gilts come down quite substantially, and it looks like, the way the stock's priced into the future, there's a bit more stability coming in. Interest rates look like they're coming down a little, but even though that inflation went up again in the last month, but it's sort of minimal. But I suppose what we do have to be aware of is those sectors in terms of affordability for people who rent or who buy, is on a day-to-day or a month-to-month basis, what bits of those inflation are actually affecting the most. And I was hearing today that food inflation particularly has gone up. It is continuing to go up.
And I think on that point, it's how it affects different portions of society. So when you look, if you're I don't know, the rental market that is your customer base, say, is the bottom 10% of earners in that location. Things like energy, which typically used to take up 7% of a household's income for that bottom 10%, is now 20%. Food as well has gone up exponentially. And so where does that money come from? Because there was never any kind of discretionary fund for the lower income households. So that's where it's difficult for those. And yes, we're seeing kind of a big increase in minimum wage going up and benefits have been coming up and LHA rates. But nominally, it's still small. And so how is that going to be factored in? I think it's
factored in by I suppose rents being held down in a way. And the thing is about rents is because you and I have discussed mortgages and how affordable they are because of the way that you can manipulate those financial instruments to make them affordable for length of mortgages and so forth. But with rents, you can't do that. With rent, it's, if you like, self-regulating, because despite the fact that they have gone up a lot, fundamentally, nobody can afford to spend what if they don't have it at the wage pack at the end of the month. That's it.
And this is why supply and demand is secondary to affordability in the rental market, because it doesn't matter if you've got only one house that 20 families need. If you've priced it too high, they can't pay.
They can't afford it. Yeah. I mean, you might find that a couple of families will pile in together, but that's probably not ideal either. And there has been a bit more sort of, I think, a rise in shares and stuff like that. But fundamentally, I know there are a lot of people who are big fans of rent controls. I'm not particularly. I'm sort of looked at what sort of happened to
Scotland's
been a
disaster.
But also even places like Berlin, which is often held up with the meat speaking and stuff like that. If you look at some of the older units, the investors can't afford.
They don't recapitalise.
No, they can't afford to. Yeah. So so that's always an issue. And I think that if you're City Council, I mean, you are going to say, we need rent controls because his
votes,
his support base. Yeah, and that's the trouble with politics in this country is that you angle your votes or some of the policies to pacify your support base, and we just don't think long term enough in this country.
Well, for everything that China does bad, what they do well is have a long term outlook. Yeah. Okay, so fantastic. And when you compare the single-family rentals to the rest of the build-to-rent market, how does that compare in terms of investment going to maturity? So in the build-to-rent sector, we hear a lot about an average time from money going into planning, then building the apartments, to then starting to get income in from rents again, is typically around 7 years. Is there more speed? How do the returns differ in terms of single family, and why might investors look at that over a typical build to rent scheme?
Well, just before I touch on the single family housing thing, in terms of the speed that comes through, I think what's important to notice that I had a really interesting statistic the other day from Cortland Consulting, and that was quite an interesting. They did some research, and I'm going to get this entirely wrong, but it's going to be pretty much ballpark. And the way that the metric that they used was the number of days it took for a single unit in the block to come to be operational, if you like, compared to a for sale block. That's from getting consent to being operational.
Okay.
And the metric that they use, I want to get this right because I don't go on the phone telling me I got it completely wrong. But anyway, it was something like it's on average 6 days for for
From getting
a
completed.
home within a rental block
Yeah.
to be produced when you sort of divide it all down. But with the sales stuff, it's 30 days. And I went, so basically, multifamily comes out of the ground sort of 6 times faster. So it was, that's just sort of my take on it. I don't know if it's the case, but certainly it's producing. Going back to the single family housing stuff, well, it's better for cash flow because you can deliver houses in tranches.
Yeah.
And typically, if you're using a traditional building, you might deliver 5 every month. Well, great. So basically, you can, and that's great for absorption rates because you're not bringing to the market.
You're not competing with yourself. Yeah.
You're not competing with yourself. And the trouble with. I mean, it's not a problem, but it's a operational issue. Mobilization is an operational issue because your investor will deliver the operational manager 300 flats all in one go, pretty much in one go. And you go, okay, there's your 300, fill them up. Well, you're not doing that. So you don't have to. So basically, you're doing it much more gradually. And you're also getting cash in by rent as they've been delivered to you over time. So it's much simpler. And also, it's much faster to build houses.
Mm-hmm.
So, and more sustainable. So
fantastic.
It's a win-win for them because not just that, but also the metrics around churn and so forth are much more favourable in terms of the houses because people stay longer.
Well, average tenancies in a single family house are far longer than they are in a 1 or 2 bed flat. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing is, I know that I'm going to be marmalised by the multifamily market, but those people that will tell me what the churn is in the big blocks say it's about 50% annually. Mm. Whereas if you're building, and I've sort of touched on this before, why single family is better in a multi-tenure environment.
Sure.
Is that they are much stickier because they make friends with people who own.
Yeah, of course.
And people are fully invested in that area.
And also, families want to lay down roots.
Absolutely.
And it's families tend to prefer, like the stats show, prefer houses over apartments because you've got schools, things like that.
Outside space.
Yeah.
Your own outside space, that you can use. I mean, one of the reasons I think there was a flight to the country during COVID is that people just simply couldn't go outside. Mm-hmm. They could use balconies, but not for any, real purpose. Apart from perhaps some sort of vertical opera, but they couldn't have barbecues on and stuff like that. Well, you can do that. You can do all the normal things in life, and you can do them autonomously. You don't have to have permission from anybody. You just do what you do. Yeah. And as soon as you walk through your front door, you're in. You use no corridors or lifts or whatever to go into. You own your space, and you can park your car outside if you've got one, or you can charge it up if you've got an electric one. They are so flexible in terms of spaces.
And so what advice would you give to some of these kind of SME landlords and investors who are trying to grow a portfolio of residential property in the UK? What tips or advice would you give to them at the moment?
Well, first of all, I'd say, join the UK SFA. There'll be a link in there.
There will be a link.
And the reason for that is not because we're not membership growth focused. We're all about trying to get across to people that we need more houses, which any way we can help do that. It's kind of say so as an institutional business, we've learned from everybody within the sector. It's arrogant to think that there's nothing that the institutional sector can earn from smaller SME investors, because that's rubbish. We can all learn from each other, but we can only learn if we do it collectively. And so really it's basically about join organizations like us. It's not expensive to do so. And you get access to a whole lot of stuff. You get access to government lobbying and all that kind of stuff, and learning and policy and stuff. Not only get access to it, you get to influence it, you get to comment on it, and you get to say, okay, this is what we're doing, and you get to see the trends that are evolving, and you access to that kind of data as well about what's happening in terms of, we've discussed, for instance, funding, how that's looking in the future, because the big institutions are telling us what's happening, what's going on. We've got people like for instance, I'm quite close to some of the people in PFP Capital. It used to be called PFP Capital. It's called Thriving Investors. I got it wrong. So, they are, as a quasi RP, but also investment fund nowadays, they have a lot of sort of influence about what's going on. And what's great about the sector, the institutional sector, and what I'd like the SME sector to be part of, is sharing all this knowledge. to make everything that we do better, because we can. And if you're invested in doing better, which I think we should all be, obviously, yes, we're in it for our own purposes and to create wealth for ourselves, but I genuinely don't think that you should be in housing unless you have at least one eye on the social purpose.
I think the building wealth is a byproduct, isn't it?
Yeah. I think there's with housing particularly, I think there's a social purpose in it, even if you're not producing social housing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think you're investing in, you're having a social impact in what you're doing. And I think that at everybody's heart, they want to make things better than they've been, not just in housing, but in everything. But where you can influence it, where we can influence it, which is the housing piece, let's just make it a great place to be.
Absolutely. Richard, that's been absolutely fantastic conversation. Loved having you on the show, and hopefully we can get you back again soon.
Oh, I hope so. Yeah, it'd be great. We'll tell you how things go.
Yeah, brilliant.